Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you here. Thank you for taking the time this summer to do a little learning with us on our annual summer learning series. We have to do a couple of announcements and commercials in the beginning before we get rolling. So next week, please join us back here, 7 o'clock. I believe Rabbi Feinstein is going to be teaching next week. I just got back from vacation like 2 days ago, so I'm not sure of the schedule yet. Rabbi Feinstein is teaching.
Rabbi Feinstein will be doing
Sex in this. How could you not come to that one? That sounds amazing.
So be sure and read it, and then bring your book.
Bring your book. That's right. Also, if you are, speaking of holidays, just make sure that if you need to get tickets or membership or any of that, just get that out of the way now so that you can come just join us on the holidays without any problems. You and 5,000 of your closest friends. Yes?
Tickets will be mailed out next Monday.
Is that when they'll be mailed?
We're doing the work on Monday.
Okay, Monday is when, that's when okay, so Monday they will be stuffed and either they'll be mailed Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning. So that way you should expect them just a few days later, okay? It's a wonderful thing, the whole crew. It's like going to a campaign headquarters for some candidate and they're all stuffing envelopes and it's very cool. Okay, so good evening everyone. We are looking at, this series is looking at Rabbi Schulweiss's book, In God's Mirror. We have been spending this year since his passing reading and reflecting on his works, and this cycle is we're looking at this one, which is this book called In God's Mirror. How many of you were here last week, just as a show of hands? Okay, so some of you have had sort of the brief introduction to everything we've done so far. Let me just tell you a little bit about this book, and then we'll jump right into tonight's topic. This book was a series of lectures. It started out as a series of lectures that the rabbi gave here, mostly, and some at AJU, about a series of different topics. That's why if you were to look at the table of contents, and you will see that it's not a single topic book. It's not a narrative. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's very topical because it's been pasted together from a lot of different lectures on various subjects. Okay, and that is why this book, how this book came together. The title for this book, In God's Mirror, is a quote from a Jewish text, a certain midrash, that talks about when the Israelites were standing at Mount Sinai and they saw God. One of the versions that they saw was a God who was standing as a statue, and that statue could make eye contact with every single person who was standing at Sinai, kind of like the Mona Lisa effect. And then the next rabbi said, well, God wasn't a statue, because that's too anthropomorphized. God was like a mirror. And then the people could see God's mirror as a way of seeing ourselves in God and God in ourselves. And that became a major trope for Rabbi Schulweiss's work. And that's why he chose this as the title. So tonight's discussion study, not really lecture, is going to be looking at the first section of the book, which is about pluralism. So if you have your books, we'll be looking at various selections from the 4 essays entitled Jewish Apartheid, The Pendulum of Pluralism, Love with a Beer Hug Around My Soul, and From Either Or to Both And. Okay? And if you would like to share with someone next to you, we're all friends here, please feel free to share. I actually really think, on the deepest level, that this topic is probably the most important in this book and probably the most important apropos for where we are as a Jewish community today. Maybe not where we were even 6 months ago, but where we are today as a Jewish community. And let me explain what I mean before we get into the text. Today alone, I have received something like 25 different emails from various organizations, Jewish organizations, non-Jewish organizations, local organizations, national organizations, international organizations, asking me to sign various petitions for or against the Iran nuclear deal. And I think I originally was going to make the decision that I was going to sign every petition. whether it was for or against. That way, nobody would have liked what I had to say. Hello. Oh, hi, Malka. Come on in. And everyone would be equally angry at me, so that means that I could probably standing in a good place. And I'm not kidding. In the last 24 hours, I think I've gotten 25 emails to that effect. Sign this petition, sign that petition, come out on this side for this Iran deal, come out on this side against the Iran deal, etc., etc., etc. And the reason why I think this section of the book on pluralism is so important is because we are entering, I believe, into a very dangerous territory as a community. This deal on Iran, regardless of who the winner or the loser is tearing our community apart. I have children who don't talk to their parents. I have people who are pulling out of various different communities, asking for their donations back. I have people who are outright vilifying people who don't share their same opinion over this particular deal. And of course, the irony of all of this is that Israel isn't mentioned once in the deal. The deal is actually not about Israel, it's about Iran. And of course, the implications have a lot to do with Israel. But it is becoming a divining rod that is, we are using, each side is using it as a divining rod as to adjudicate whether or not you are worthy or not to be called part of our community. And that's why I think this section of the book is so timely. To take a different view, not about this political realm of the deal with Iran, but to think about what the last 12 or even 24 months has looked like in the Jewish community internationally, leaving Israel aside entirely. We have on the one hand a Pew study that has shown that Jews are leaving Judaism in unprecedented rates. That intermarriage or not, although that's one of the symptoms of it, that Jews are ever distancing themselves from the community and tradition. Certainly a large number of Jews don't have any faith in God or necessarily even in the Jewish people, and that they describe themselves as a Jew but can't articulate what that means, and that it doesn't look good for future generations about what it means to be Jewish. And at the same time, earlier this summer, someone who claimed to be a true part of the true Judaism movement murdered another Jew on the streets of Jerusalem because she was marching in the gay pride parade. And what this murderer advocated for was a violent reaction to the slippery slope of Jewish heathenism, in his view, that warranted a violent reaction. And so, not only is the Iran deal tearing our community apart, there seems to be a philosophical moment that we are standing in, that on the one hand, we are being pulled apart by those who are secularizing ourselves as a community to the extent that we are distancing ourselves as a community, and we are becoming more fundamentalist as a community and turning violence on ourselves. So not only is the political left-right divide around this deal with Iran and how we feel about it tearing us apart, we have this other divide that's happening at the same time. I think this is a more vicious cycle. This version of Jewish conversation or lack thereof is a more vicious cycle than I have ever experienced or even read about in the modern period. Maybe in some pre-modern world or at the very dawn of modernism, when we were just coming out of the shtetl, there was this bickering and back and forth. But German Jews still took care of Polak Jews when they came to New York. Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews still regarded each other as Jewish, even if they didn't want to talk to them or associate with each other. Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews and Reform Jews were still bound to this idea of Klal Yisrael on one level or another. As much as Orthodox Jews would look askance at Reform Jews or conservative Jews and never let themselves have weddings or bar mitzvahs in our own facilities, they would still say we're Jews, we're just not very good Jews. And as much as we would look, or non-Orthodox Jews would look at Orthodox Jews and say they're backwards and primitive, or their views on women are all wrong, we would still respect them and be embarrassed if they did anything that we didn't agree with, because we feel like it would reflect badly on us because we still believe that they are Jews. But what's happening, I believe, in this very moment is the drawing and quartering of our community in different directions. And I'm not sure what to do about it. And that's why I think Rabbi Schulweis's work on pluralism here lays really good sort of foundation stones for at least giving us a framework from which to think about it. And that's what we're going to do tonight. So maybe you can help me and we can help each other think of a framework to maybe sew this thing back together again and find a way of what happens after the deal is voted up or down or vetoed or overridden, so that our families can still talk to each other and our communities can still be a part of each other. And maybe we can think of a way of holding the middle framework that is neither strictly atheist with a slight communal or spiritual inclination, or strictly fundamentalist, which is intolerant and violent. That's our task tonight. Hope you're up for it. So let's begin, okay? Let's take a look if you've got the book. Let's see what some of Rabbi Schulweis's writings have to do with this very idea of pluralism. If you turn to page 17. Yes, Marty.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm just curious if you have a sense of whether obviously the way you describe the tension is here, but you have a sense that that exists in Israel and
Absolutely.
other communities where there aren't. So
Absolutely. In Israel, the women who wanted to daven with a Torah scroll had to sneak a Torah into the kotel in the middle of the night and sit vigil with it all night long so they might be able to have the Torah with them when they davened in the morning, because they were afraid of being arrested and having the Sefer Torah confiscated by the Jewish police that policed the kotel. We live in a day and age when the president of Israel said a bar and bat mitzvah of a special needs community, a special needs family, should be obviated because the rabbi who was going to participate in that bar and bat mitzvah was not Orthodox. We still live in a day and age when Israelis on their own have to leave the country to get married, to fly to Cyprus to get married in order to have a recognized Jewish wedding that isn't officially sanctioned by Orthodoxy. So these issues are important, and they continue to tear at us. And if we don't figure out a way of addressing them in some deep philosophical way, then those who grow up without the good memories of Klal Yisrael might just walk away because they don't see value in it. That's what we risk. We risk generations not speaking to each other. We risk geographically people not speaking to each other, politically. And when we stop the dialogue, that's when we stop being a community. And I think the rabbi, Zichrono Livracha, saw that and was trying to create a different framework, which is what we're going to look at tonight. We're starting on page 17. I had not announced the page yet. Page 17, okay? Okay, we're not going in order of each one of the essays. We're just going by topic. So the first place to begin in the modern period has to be with the self. So he writes on page 17 under the heading, The Pluralistic Self. Is everyone with me who has a book? Anyone not with me? Let's read. The Pluralistic Self. So he says, the deeper challenge of pluralism is not external, how to maintain housekeeping in an ark filled with lions, lambs, hawks, doves, orthodox and non-orthodox, religious and secular. That's a reference to Noah's ark with all the different animals in it. The challenge is internal, within the pluralistic self. Ein bichlal ele ma shebifrat. There is nothing in general which is not in the particular. That's a quote from the Mishnah. If I can attain the goal of unity in diversity within, it may serve as a clue to appreciate the blessing of a pluralistic society without. I know myself to be a person of many moods and dispositions. I can hear him say that. I am alternatively optimistic and pessimistic, liberal and conservative, hawkish and dovish. I am moved by Yosef Be'er Soloveitchik and Mordechai Kaplan, by Herman Cohen and Martin Buber. Moreover, I admit to finding no small joy and strength in holding on with both hands to the multiple strands which pull against each other. This delight in contrariety enjoys distinguished company. I think of Reb Naftali of Ropshitz, who in a vision described how before his birth angels presented him with a double column of counsel. On one side there appeared a statement from Ta'anit, a scholar who should live like a flaming fire of wrath. And on the other side appeared a sentence from Sanhedrin, a scholar should be meek, humble, and forgiving. On one side of the column, a declaration from Eruvin, a man cannot know Torah without sacrificing his concern for his family. And on the other side from Chulin, a man of Torah must have regard for his family more than for himself. And on one side, an admonition to be satisfied with a minimum, and from the same tractate on Ta'anit on the other, he who pledges himself not to drink wine and afflicts the body is called sinner. The two columns of apparently contradictory statements were endless, and while Reb Naftali pondered over the list, his birth was announced. He resolved to live his life following the counsel of both columns, to hold both sides in loving embrace. It is the challenge of the pluralistic self to choose the dialectic tension of both and over the hard disjunctive of either or. It calls for wisdom and courage and spirit of inclusiveness whose roots lie in the soil of monotheism. Sectarianism breathes the spirit of exclusive either or choice. Polarities are turned into polarization, distinctions into irreconcilable antagonism. In the Havdalah ceremony, the wisdom of Jewish monotheism differentiates between Sabbath and weekday, the holy and neutral, light and darkness, Israel and other peoples. Between is not against. The differentiation points to distinctiveness, not to opposition. The dualities of complementary energies, they need each other for the sake of wholeness. Here is no ceremony celebrating the primordial wars of Manichaean dualism, but the organic unity, and rejects uniformity along with anarchy. Pluralism, the rabbi says, begins in the self. He has this amazing story from Rabbi Naftali of Ropshitz, who says when he was born, the moment before he was born, he was presented with two co-equal, irreconcilable, irreducible truths about how to be in the world. And while he was davening between the two columns, his birth was announced and he was brought into this world. And the choice was not to live by one or the other, but to live by both. How many of us feel this way? How many of us are willing to live by both columns? How many of us are willing to listen to the opinions of someone you vehemently disagree with and allow yourself to be affected by those opinions? How many of us are willing to take into our ear the words of one and the words of the other and make them like a hopper and to allow them to bangle around and bump around and let us really think about what each opinion says? This might be the task of a judge. This might be a task of a jury or a lawyer, but how many of us do this on a regular basis? Unfortunately, I believe in our day, given how media is spread, given how information is shared with each other, we tend to tune out one of those columns, whatever those columns might be. We tend to tune out one of those channels, preferring to only see the sycophants around us that reaffirm our own opinions about the world. And anyone who shares a different opinion is quietly deleted or unfriended or removed from our field of vision. And that means that those who share differing opinions no longer are our friends. They are something else. And so the rabbi, I believe, saw this, and not in the same technological way that we have today, but even when he wrote this, saw that pluralism has to begin with the self. There is no other way of approaching the world in a mature, steady, fashioned way that allows for personal growth if you don't read both columns simultaneously or one after the other and allow yourself to be affected by both. Some of you don't know this, maybe many of you do, but I served in the military. I was a chaplain in the U.S. Navy. And while all my super liberal, progressive, unionizing friends asked me why I went into the military, I said for two reasons. One, I didn't want to be the first man in my family not to go into the military. That would have been shameful for me. Ever since my great-grandfather came over here from Hungary, every one of his sons served in the military, and every one of his sons served in the military, and I felt an obligation to this country to do the same. And the second was, and more philosophical than that, was I was tired of hearing all of my progressive, left-leaning, unionizing friends talk to me about how terrible the war is and how terrible the policies are and vilifying the soldiers who were choosing to fight in it. So I chose to sign up. And I met people who are very different than me, people that I care about deeply, and I learned a lot through that process. And I think we are too easily made comfortable by our own opinions, and we're not willing to grow by becoming a little bit uncomfortable. In fact, I got a message today from a friend of mine who is a Baptist preacher serving on the USS Somerset in the middle of nowhere, of which he couldn't tell me where, of just what he was doing that day, and wishing me a happy new year because he knew that the new year was coming. And I would have never met that sailor if I hadn't joined the military. So I think this is one of our challenges, is that we no longer allow ourselves to be pluralistic. Let's look on page 19 where he outlines the second challenge. This is the ethic and wisdom of pluralism, if you look on page 19. He says, do pluralists go about like Will Rogers, insisting that they never met a theology or ideology they didn't like? I know plenty of people who do that. Do pluralists ever say no? Pluralism is not the surrender of debate or the bleaching of passionate conviction. The House of Hillel argued, debated, and disagreed with the House of Shammai on major issues, but they held on to their religious modesty because they were humble, because they studied not only their decisions but those of their adversaries, because they even recorded the ruling of the House of Shammai before their own. Their view prevailed. And that's true. He's quoting this section of Talmud, now very famous. The reason why Hillel is quoted and lauded by the Jewish community through the ages is not because his opinions were more relevant or more well argued than Shammai's. In fact, the opposite was true. Bless you. Shammai's opinion was usually more well argued. It was sharper. It was cleaner. His proofs were cleaner. But because they weren't humble, and they weren't willing to include Hillel's proofs along the side of their own, but Hillel was willing to do the reverse, the opposite. We've come to rule based on Hillel's rulings all but 6 times. There are only 6 places that Beit Shammai rules out over Beit Hillel. Not worth going into which ones tonight, but in the thousands of rulings that the two schools made, it is the humility that rules and how we should be as human beings. He continues, he says, pluralism calls forth an ethic of openness, a disposition towards inclusiveness, and beyond its ethic of responsible tolerance, it holds a pragmatic wisdom. Rashi, commenting on the rabbinic judgment concerning the controversies between houses of Shammai and Hillel, he said, both speak the words of the living God, and explains that there are times when one reason is valid and other times when another reason is valid. For reasons change in the wake of even only small changes in the situation. There are going to be times when it's important for us to embrace a more strict way of looking at our religion. And there will always be times when we have to relax those restrictions. There will be times when something can be considered treif in one instance and then should be considered kosher in another. There are times when we must cry out to slow down the wheels of progress in order to make sure that it's being done in an authentic way. And there are times when we must step on the pedal because we see that what progress is called for because it's injurious to people. What we're doing is injurious to people. One time, it might be one way one day, and 10 years later, something else completely different. But without an ethic of openness and humility, we can't take the two views into our heart. and realize that we're supposed to be one people. He says, the Jewish sages of France in the 13th century understood the variety of interpretations and rulings, sometimes conflicting, as a blessing. When Moses ascended to receive the Torah, he was shown in every case 49 possibilities to forbid and 49 possibilities to permit. The intention was that all these possibilities of interpretation should be entrusted to the sages of Israel of each generation, that the decision be in accordance with their resolutions, cited by Eliezer Berkowitz. There is no contradiction in the disagreement of authorities. Situations change, and what once was permitted may now be prohibited. What was once prescribed may later be allowed. Why was it necessary to record the opinions of Shammai and Hillel that do not prevail? To teach the generations that come after that none should persist in his opinion, for lo, the fathers of the world did not persist in their opinion. He's arguing what I think is the most profound point. Do not fall into the idea that your opinion is the opinion in perpetuity. Do not let yourself slack into hubris by understanding that all of your ideas and opinions, your way of seeing the world, is the only way to express a Jewish idea. And so when we call each other terrible names, or we pull out the knives and literally try to kill each other because you are no longer Jewish in my eyes, you are othered in my eyes, we have lost this so important Talmudic idiom that each one of us carries in our heart the opinions of both Hillel and Shammai. So what he's saying is in this section, our Jewish tradition has the elasticity to handle any situation if only you allow it to. You have to read both columns. Everyone with me so far? Okay, good. Yeah, Marty.
Well, do you actually, is it a sin not to read it?
No, because the halakha has to be like somebody. We have to either vote for the Iran deal or we have to vote against it. Sitting in the middle like this is tearing us apart. Now the question is, at the end of the day, what's going to happen to our community? If we vote for the Iran deal and it passes, then all of those who vehemently hate the Iran deal are going to hate the people who voted for it, and they're going to denounce those people who voted for the Iran deal as not true Zionists or not true Jews, and then as traitors, as villains, and it can create a serious problem. If the Iran deal is voted down, then those who felt they won in that battle feel like these Zionists, these pro-Israel right-wingers, right, are not really part of the Jewish conversation. That's why he began tonight's lecture by saying I got 25 emails from different organizations on all sides of this deal asking me to sign petitions. And Malka, you weren't here, but I said, I feel like I should sign every single one of them, even though they're on both sides of the spectrum, just so that everyone hates me the same. Because I'm actually not worried about what's going to happen when they vote. Because we will figure it out. We've always figured it out. We will figure it out. I am worried what's going to happen to our community the morning after. And that is what worries me, and I think that's the moment we're standing in. I think Rabbi Schulweis understood that for the issues of his day, and if he was standing right here, he would probably be teaching the same lecture tonight. Probably to 100 more people, but that's okay. I don't take it personally. Yes, Dove.
Okay, I can accept your argument. I can see the difference. But at what point do I say, up to this point, but I can't go any further?
I think, so his question is, are there limits? Are there limits? This is the classic question about pluralism. Are there limits? Are there things which are in and things which are out? Yes, I think that there are. There has to be. Otherwise, what are we talking about? Is there no coherence to our own tradition or our own community? I think that those things, though, are tested over great lengths and times. And I'm talking about over millennia. So, for example, right? We agree as a community that God is unified, that there's only one God. If you were to tell me that you wanted to start, as part of our tradition, a cult davening to God's female presence called the Shekhinah, and that you would only worship to that Shekhinah, and that you would think that that Shekhinah is somehow separate from the rest of the Godhead, and that we should create our own rituals definitely to bring in Shekhinah and to only focus on that, have nothing to do with the unification of God, you're basically creating a religion that is no longer monotheistic, that is polytheistic. I would say you are about to step off the boat and no longer a part of this. If you were to embrace Jesus as a prophet, a valid prophet in our community, and say that Jesus was the Messiah who came and will come again, I think that's a little too far.
Just one thing more. The people who are disagreeing about the Iran thing, the ones who are against, many of them can see in their face the destruction of Israel. They can see the fires and the bombing and the destroying of Israel completely.
Who are against the Iran deal. Yes, I agree with that. Many of them will see that, do see that. That's right.
So at what point can they say up to this point and no further?
Malco, do you want to go ahead?
The issue is not that that's what they believe, but if someone else believes another way, they say you are a traitor. That is where they step over the line. Because the human brain wants certainty. So if I think my position is so sure that I can't go any further and I have to stay there, okay. But I can't say that you, who see more ambivalence in that, are ignorant, traitorous, stupid, any pejorative that you want. That's the difference. The difference is not in the way you perceive a position, but in how you conceive the opposition. Even in the instance that you raise, supposing someone wants to worship Jesus and says it's Jewish, and you say you can't accept that. You can't just say you can't accept it. You have to show why not. You have to be able to deal intellectually with it.
With a spirit of openness
That's
at the same time. Even if I never, right, so one of the versions of pluralism is that you have the right to be wrong. That is, I think, a minimal, actually diminutive version of pluralism. Like if I were to say, what's the minimum threshold of what pluralism is? Most mediocre version of pluralism is you have the right to be wrong. Because pluralism is so much more than that. Yeah, go ahead. Please.
incredible strength of the entire biblical narrative is not only the moral law, but the moral law delivered by every person in the Bible who is flawed, including Moses. Every person is presented with a flaw. That is no accident. That is a teaching moment for how we, the transmitters of the moral law, have to present ourselves to the world. Must remember.
One of the dangers of monotheism is becoming what's called monistic, which is this idea of everything, everything has to fall under a single category. It's like only choosing to read one of those two columns that I was talking about. Monism is the idea that there is one idea that is an overarching idea, a totalizing idea, and everything that fits into it is good and right and part of the system, and something that doesn't does not. And we, as any community in the world, should know better than anyone else that totalizing systems leave people in and they leave people out. And we have been out for a long time. We've always been the other, and we have paid dearly for that. And so our religion actually is not monistic. That's the difference between monotheism and monism, is that monotheism, God's transcendence and ubiquity, allow for pluralism within and unending. So turn to page 46. I said we're not going to go through this chronologically. We're just skip jumping to get to what I think are the most important points for where we are as a community today. Okay? 46. So one of the questions then is, what about God's law? It says in Leviticus, a man shall not sleep with another man. It's an abomination. If you are a fundamentalist and you are watching someone march in a parade that celebrates this vicious abomination, and you believe that it was an affront not just to you personally, but to everything you hold dear and to your family and to your God, don't you feel like you have an obligation to stop it, to protest it, to maybe do whatever it takes to stop it, including violence? That's monism. It doesn't fit in your schema, and so you have to eliminate it. That's the danger of law. I'll admit that right now, that divine law given out in that way can be seen as monistic. Except that we have thousands of years of rabbinic commentary that have taken some of the laws that we find most offensive and has nullified them. Or we have raised up laws that didn't exist before and created them. So Rabbi Schulweis has a nice meditation on this on page 46, not about the issue I just raised, which is an issue for today, but something that he was focusing on. It says, the Christian characterization of the Jewish law as oppressive and of the Pharisaic rabbis as narrow-minded legalist distorted the liberating and democratizing character of the halakha, which is Hebrew for law. One of the consequences of the Pharisaic approach to the Bible study was its popularization among the people. The democratization of learning weakened the influence of miracle men and their charismatic magnetism. The text, not the prophet, was called holy, perfect, divine, and the text was open to all. Neither voices from heaven, moving cherub trees, nor falling walls held still could detract from the law based on verse and chapter and applied contextually by human intelligence. Interpreters of the text, often locked in conflicting judgments, were equally regarded. These and those are both the words of the living God. It doesn't matter what God said originally. What matters is how that law is applied in context. And in the story he's talking about, which is about an oven of all things and whether that oven is kosher or not, the world was almost torn apart over it. In the end of the day, they kicked God out of the Beit Midrash and said, this isn't your fight. And that context is what shapes the tenor of law to the shape of human beings. So he writes, the law in the hands of the rabbinic scholars humanized revelation, allowed it growth, continuity, and change. God's wisdom was not exhausted with the theophany at Sinai. That means God's appearance at Sinai. Things not revealed to Moses were revealed to Akiva. This, the rabbis explained, was due to the omniscience of his word. Divine truth is given at once and would overwhelm a generation and congeal the hearts of a nation with fear. With such a concept of progressive revelation, the rabbis could free the people from the priestly and patrician bibliolatry, meaning making the Bible into an idol. They could transform the Pentateuchal lex talionis, the so-called eye for an eye law of retaliation, into a complex code entailing monetary compensation in consideration for the pain and unemployment, medical expenditures, and humiliation suffered by the victim. They took eye for an eye and turned it into a system of fines and confinement. You now hurt someone and you end up breaking their arm. Nobody's going to come and break your arm, even though that's clear what the Torah meant by eye for an eye. Nobody's going to come and rip your tooth out. Nobody's going to come and poke your eye out. What you have to do is evaluate how much pain, suffering, and loss of income that they will have over the rest of their lifetimes, and you must compensate them for that. Does that sound familiar? Okay. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says anybody who injures someone else, he too shall be injured the same. If you took a monistic view of law, that has to be the law today. That is what fundamentalists do. That is what fundamentalists in other religions are currently doing. If we can do this for lex talionis when it comes to physically injuring each other, could we not do that for the law in Leviticus? Which we can then shaped to the will of real human beings who just want a blessing from us to be part of the community. Pluralism means not just that you have the right to be wrong, is that you have more than rights. Right is not even the concept that is operative here. Pluralism isn't just the right to be wrong. Pluralism is a sense of openness and togetherness, of yielding to each other for the sake of something greater. And for us, that means the law must also yield when appropriate, and we must also yield when appropriate to the law. And it's in that interplay that we find our truest meaning and what we think God wants from us in this day and age. But the only way to come to that is now on the page 47, okay? This is the both and. There are scholarly as well as pragmatic reasons to resist a characterization of Jewish ethics neatly tailored to our own particular bias. The rabbis, judges, philosophers whose spirit is reflected in Judaism did not consciously sit down to create a uniform and unambiguous code of ethics. Right? We never decided to sit down and say, this is the way the law is, and I'll give it to you in 140 characters or less. That was a Twitter joke. I don't know if you guys picked up on that one. The civilizational character of Jewish ethics cannot be simply located. It is better apprehended when viewed as an indispensable part of an organic totality which weaves jurisprudence and theology, legend and philosophy into a religious civilizational fabric. Such a schema exhibits the generalized aim of Jewish ethical life, Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name, binding heaven with earth, countenancing no rupture in God's universe, transforming the secular into the holy, knitting together the torn fragments of what was originally whole, praying towards the day when his name shall be one. Sanctification uses every means at its command: prayer, charity, piety, social action, body and soul, heart and mind. The ethics of Judaism clings, therefore, to both prophet and priest, holds both the love of Israel and that of mankind, meaning all of humanity, believes both in the world to come and the imperatives to labor in this world, remembers the power of human freedom and recalls its frustrating limitations. It's both God-centered and aware of the centrality of the self. These conjunctions are not taken by the tradition as paralyzing paradoxes, throwing man into despair. They are, in fact, complementary values, expressions of healthy tradition, rooted in the twin principles of reality and ideality, in what is and what ought to be. They manifest the dialectic of love and wisdom which reflects the complexity and maturity of life. Mature living and mature religion is not either this or that. It's not either or. Polarities need to not turn into polarizations, as he said before, and nor dualities into dualisms, nor ideologies into segregating sects. What he's saying there is the way that we have to think is not, there is never a zero-sum game when it comes to this community. You and I might completely disagree about what to do about Iran. You and I might come to a decision that is very different from each other. But to walk away from the table and to tell me that you're a traitor, and that I'm a traitor, and to tell you that you're a traitor because simply that is how you live, and that is the nature of the fabric of our reality, we are no longer living in the same world. That is the danger that we have as a Jewish community, seems to be strung up and ready to be drawn and quartered by all of these conflicts that we have. We're going to tear ourselves apart. So there's a second image, and that is of the pendulum, which is where we'll turn back now. Because I've outlined all the problems, right? Let's talk about the pendulum. So come back now to page 20. This is kind of where we'll center the last part of this talk, and then we'll wrap up, okay? The pendulum. So against everything that we know, everything that we've seen, everything that we've heard, all the things that we've talked about tonight, the risks that we're taking, Rabbi Schulweis believes there's an image that sticks with him and should stick with us about how we should walk through the world. He says, against the denominational image of Judaism as a single stone cast down from above, to which each claims solitary possession, I propose another image for the pluralistic outlook, that of Judaism as a swinging pendulum whose arc describes its breadth and rhythm. As an ideal construct, the pendulum is defined as a material particle suspended by a weightless cord and vibrating without friction, back and forth, right? To understand the scope of Judaism and its pattern is to follow its swings, which touch the outer edges of its polarities. Mysticism and rationalism, naturalism and supernaturalism, humanism and theism, particularism and universalism, ethnicity and religiosity, all swinging back and forth. And to stop the pendulum, though, is to still its motion, to hold it at one point in order to capture its quote-unquote essence. To do that is to tamper with the vitality and sweep of our religious civilization. Such fixation is idolatrous. This is idolatry for him. One must be open to the swing of the pendulum, and we cannot know beforehand how far the pendulum will travel, nor what it will include. There is no way of knowing a priori, Gershom Scholem wrote, what beliefs are possible or impossible within the framework of Judaism. It is not so simple to call this or that un-Jewish. Who better than Scholem himself can testify to the attempts to fixate the pendulum, to dismiss Kabbalah mysticism or Hasidism, Jewish mysticism as aberrations of normative Judaism? Who knows a priori what new traditions may be sanctified and what old traditions be recovered if you let the pendulum swing? The real pendulum of Judaism, he writes, unlike its ideal construct, is neither weightless nor frictionless. There is no guarantee that it will or itself swing freely forward or backward. We cannot therefore hop a ride on the pendulum, confident that it will not become locked in arresting dogmas. But beyond the development of our own particular theologies, there is a corrective theology to be practiced in order to keep its dialectic integrity. To keep the pendulum free from fixation is a heritage of the rabbinic counterpoint, ifcha mistabera, just the opposite, or adarabba, to the contrary, or mi'idach gisa. These are all quotes from the Talmud of when the rabbis disagreed with each other. On the other hand, no two swings of the pendulum are identical. The arc of the pendulum does not describe the pagan circle of eternal recurrence. Because the pendulum swings from one pole to another, it is, on its return, altered because of the contact with the opposite pole. Tomorrow's Jewish liberalism and universalism are not likely to be the same as yesterday's. Mutatis mutandis, which means the same holds for yesterday's and tomorrow's Jewish conservatism and particularism. So what is he trying to say? You can't keep the pendulum still. And even though it's messy, and it's full of friction, and differences, and argumentation, don't think that we can just grab that pendulum and say, in order to be Jewish, you have to X, Y, or Z. You have to believe in A, B, or C. The pendulum has to keep moving because new ideas might come up, old ideas might be recovered, but that is the vitality of Jewish life because we are a religion without strict dogma. And to create a dogma around anything, whether it's about Israel, or this Iran deal one way or the other, or about who gets to love who, or about what kashrut is, or Shabbat observance, to create that as a dogma is to freeze the pendulum and eventually kill Judaism. You have to let it go. I want to end with this, because I think what he writes actually in the very beginning is probably the most important thing, because everything is philosophical until this point. If you turn back to page 13, Rabbi Schulweis was never afraid of adding the therefore in his sermons. He never really wrote a lot of therefores in his philosophical books. except that he liked to write them in the introductions and in the beginnings as a way of getting into the subject. So we turn to page 13. He says this on the second paragraph, first full paragraph. He says, "A loving, caring laity has more to do than respond to fundraising appeals." Imagine if I said that on the high holidays. "It has an obligation to demand from the leaders and institutions it supports that they report on what they are doing to staunch the flow of our hemorrhaging community. Rabbis and institutions may be made accountable to the people. Responsible philanthropy may exercise pressure out of love." Laity has to be part of this conversation. Hold someone like me accountable to making sure that we don't fall apart. That's job number one. Job number two, love for others requires understanding, compassion, self-sacrifice. Every ideology, every movement, every school of thought must yield something of its own for Klal Yisrael, the whole house of Israel. Through negotiation, reform will be asked in certain areas to modify its insistence on autonomy or on freedom of individual conscience, and will have to consider the larger community beyond its movement in matters of conversion and intermarriage. For reform, ritual immersion and circumcision, for example, may become minimal symbolic acts in the name of Klal Yisrael, and the prescription of mixed marriage may have to be more carefully enforced in the name of love and unity of Israel. That's his idea of maybe what reform would need to yield in order to be part of Klal Yisrael. On the other hand, Orthodox and conservative rabbis will be urged to respect the authority of Reform rabbis and accept their judgments in the name of Ahavat Yisrael and Klal Yisrael. Orthodox and Reform rabbis then also have to yield and say Reform rabbis have authority. So what is he charging us with? Of all the things I've said, what is the one thing he's actually charging us with? What's the one thing he's asking of the reader? Because all of this, he has some proposals and things. What's the one thing he's asking of the reader to do? Yeah.
It would seem like he's looking at the possibility of taking what could be considered to be opposite poles and bringing them closer together.
That's, I think, partially. I don't think he wants to bring them closer together. I think he wants to keep them in the same clock, I guess, if you were to look at a grandfather. Like, it's not that the Orthodox or the right-wing, pro-Israel group should change their views about how they feel. It's not that they have to draw closer to a left-wing, religiosity or a left-wing political understanding. It's that they have to see each other in the same clock. So I don't think that they're actually trying to come together. What do you think they're trying to do? How about over here? Yeah, Diane. Just go ahead.
There's no right or wrong. There's only your interpretation.
I don't think he says it either. I think that there are rights and wrongs, especially when it comes to injuring other people. But I do think that he believes that interpretation is important. But he's asking something of the reader. What was the last thing I read? What is he asking for each of us to do? And don't just sit there and listen. Don't come to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and expect that the only thing that you're going to get out of services is to say, the rabbi spoke about something nice, or I wrote my check or folded my little thing over, or any of that stuff. He expects all of us, the laity and the rabbinate, to be involved in these discussions, because if we're not, and it's only me or it's only you, we will fail. We will fail because we don't have the strength on our own. The laity has to be involved. Even if the role is just to hold me accountable, the laity has to be involved in this conversation actively, passionately, to show up and be part of this conversation. And not just to let the professionals duke it out over social media. And he's saying that the rabbis, the professional class, we have to not forget or to not ignore what the laity is saying, what the community is saying. We have to be held accountable to those views, and we have to, especially given the ability to speak to lots of people, for example, we have to know not only to whom we're speaking, but that we have the power to either create monism or monotheism. And we have to be held accountable to that. Dov.
This reminds me of Rabbi Schulweiss's story. The atheist made an appointment to speak to the rabbi.
It's in this book.
It's in the
It's in this
book.
section of the book. I just didn't read it.
Oh.
Yes.
And when the atheist walked into the room, the rabbi held up his hand and said, "Efsher," and both men embraced.
Right. Exactly right. Is it possible? Is it even... You cannot be in a world where you don't believe that faith is even a possibility, nor can you be in a world where you believe that agnosticism or atheism isn't a possibility. And you have to embrace the other. I don't know what's more loving in that story, whether it's the rabbi who embraced the atheist or the atheist who embraced the rabbi, because they both had to yield to each other. Yes. Yes.
Someone came to his office, a woman, not a member of the shul, came to his office, told me about it when he came home, and asked him if she could.
There's a mic here, Malka. Would you like?
The mic. A woman came to his office, not a member of the shul, young woman, and asked him if she should say Kaddish for her father. And he assumed that she must come from an Orthodox environment, and she was asking that question. She wasn't a member of our shul. So he questioned her further. And what it turned out was that was not the issue at all. Her father was a very hateful person, and that's why she was asking him whether she should say Kaddish for him. So he could have answered her on the basis of Jewish law, but he did not. I was so proud of him when I asked him, "What did you say to her?" He said, "I said to her, say Kaddish for the father that you wished he would have been,"
Beautiful.
and won her over.
Beautiful. You should say Kaddish for him because it's required of you, as opposed to transforming the life that was into the life that could have been, which is really part of the beauty of the partnership we have with God in creation, in death. This is what I understand to be resurrection, is not physical resurrection, but the revivification of somebody by partnering with God, by recreating who they were when you don't have any physicality of their human body anymore. Every memory is an act of creation. And that's physically true. That's not just me saying that because it's pretty. It's actually physically true. Every time you remember where your keys are, you're actually creating something in your brain, a pathway, a neural pathway. It's an act of creation. And every time you remember that time you went to Disneyland together, and how she held your hand, and how you danced the night away at your wedding, every time you remember that, you're actually recreating that. You're creating the person. You are God's partner in creation. And that's Tichiyat HaMetim, if I ever heard of it. So, last comment, because I'd like to wrap up.
A few of the examples today indicates that if only we were able to adjust our perception. In other words, when you think of the father you would have liked him to be, or when you think of rabbi and laity, or where you think of one side when the pendulum is swinging or the other, the perception is what causes us to not only understand what we think we see or what is in the present or the future, what we hear, but what action we can take. Because if we dispense with any preconceived notion and look at what's common, what causes us to feel with our heart and our soul and our being, then we see what's going to unite us. And even if we're not drawn together, we at least don't pay too much attention to the differences, but we try to see the similarity. And that's the perception. If we just have a more positive way of thinking of things, then we can achieve a result that's doable, that's possible to accomplish.
Good. Yeah, right. So essentially, the risk that we take in the process of the lack of conversation that we have today, both around the political perspectives, especially around this so-called Iran deal, and in our religious perspectives of how we see our religion, we really are standing at a real crossroads of who we're going to be as a Jewish community, as a world Jewish community, as an American Jewish community. We really risk falling apart. I don't say that as out of just fear and trying to create a situation of dire need, but there is this moment that I believe we have entered in the last 20 months that is incredibly difficult. And our response to that, the response to that is found right at the beginning, right back at the beginning of our traditions, where Rabbi Schulweis is saying, all of these texts, he's marshaling in his argument that we have to find a way of drawing in those who don't agree with us and validating their ideas as part of the larger framework of who we are, because what we risk is walking away, of closing shop, turning out the Ner Tamid and say this project is just not worth it anymore. Because we can't be entrusted with it. There's an old midrash from the book of Lamentations that say that the day the Romans breached the walls of the temple, the priests went to the roof. And they took the keys to the temple and they threw them into heaven and said, take them back. Because we can't be trusted with them. And the keys went up to heaven and the temple was destroyed. That's not the moment I want to get to. We all have a responsibility to figure out how the middle, the sacred center that has been the middle of our religion for the last 200 years, has to hold. Otherwise, we end up in a world of fundamentalism or atheism, and we end up in a world of right-wing political conservatism versus left-wing political progressivism and nothing in the middle. Or one side and the other side can't even talk to each other anymore. And we have to ask the question then, if that's really the case, is it worth it? Is America worth it as a project? Is Judaism worth it as a project? Is Israel worth it as a project? That's what we risk. And I'm not willing to let that fall apart. And I think Rabbi Schulweis has a lot to say about it. And I will be speaking about this topic on Rosh Hashanah. So I hope you come and join me for that. Have a Shana Tova, a sweet, happy, healthy New Year to each of you. And I hope to see you in just a few weeks as we begin our high holiday services together. Have a great night.